And hello, friends, and we welcome you to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Cable. Chapters is the show that profiles local writers, authors, editors, and publishers in your community. I'm Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. And on this episode of Chapters, we are joined by a very distinguished writer who's going to talk to us a little bit about projects that she has already completed with two of her books, and then some upcoming projects which are really, really exciting, and we look forward to talking with her about that. And our guest today and our writer today is Carter Taylor Seaton. And Carter's first novel, Father's Troubles, was named as a finalist for the prestigious Forward Magazine 2003 Book of the Year Award in the historical fiction category. She's a regular contributor to several regional magazines and to the West Virginia Encyclopedia. And in 2007, her article on the impact of the Back to the Land movement in West Virginia was featured in the Appalachian Literary Journal, and it won the Denny C. Plattner Award for Best Work of Nonfiction. And her most recent title is called Amo Amas Amat, Unconventional Love Story. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about that, plus some of the other projects that she is working on. And as you can tell from her biography, especially Amo Amas Amat, The Unconventional Love Story, which was selected as the Indie Reader Approved Discovery Awards Competition notable book with 4.5 stars during that awards competition. As you can tell from that and everything else that she's done, a very talented writer who has done a lot of good writing so far and has a lot of good writing in store coming up. So Carter, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Good to have you with us. Let's start and talk first about writing and how you got into writing, where your interest came from, just some background on why did you start writing?
Well, first of all, I cannot remember not reading. That's number one. When I was a child, I even had a library for my friends, and I wouldn't let them borrow my books unless they signed them out. You know? So reading has always been extremely important to me. And then I was an English major in college, and it just seemed that my whole life was consumed with books. But interestingly, I didn't become a writer until later in life, let's say. I had a background in marketing, and most of the writing I did was things like press releases and book, blurbs about things, events I was putting on, brochures, whatever. And I'd never written anything other than that, creatively. But I had this story in my family that I shared with a friend once, just the bare bones of it. And she said, "Carter, you got to write a story about that." And I said, "Allison, I'm not a writer. I write press releases. I don't write books." And she just said, "Well, it's time to start." And I sort of went, "Well, okay," and went out and bought books about how to write. One called The Weekend Novelist, and you were supposed to be able to do it in a year if you only wrote on the weekends, and I was working full time. So, you buy books, you think that if you read how to do something, you'll be able to do it. Well, that didn't work. It got me started, and it got the bug, and I started making outlines and notes and doing real research on the topic. And that's Father's Troubles, the book I first wrote and published. And over a course of maybe 15 years, I did research about this story, because at that time I only had the bare bones of it. And then Patrick Grace from here in Huntington, I'd moved back to Huntington by then. I was living in Georgia when I first got this challenge. And I moved back to Huntington, and Patrick was having his very first life writing class. And I read about it in the newspaper and called up the museum to sign up, and they said, "It's full." And I said, no, it can't be full. I have to get in this class. So I contacted Patrick, and I told him that I really wanted to be in this class, and so he made room for me. And then I proceeded to say I didn't want to write about myself. I wanted to write about someone else. So he let me stay, and because of that class, I learned that there was another way to tell a story besides just straight nonfiction. Because the story occurred 10 years and beyond that, earlier than that, before I was ever born. And there wasn't anybody who was either willing or alive to tell me what truly happened. So the bare bones of the story is that it's about a girl, me, but it's not me in the book. who learns when she's grown that all the stories she'd ever heard about one of her grandparents or grandfather is essentially not true. It is to a point, but the rest of the story, as you know, they would say, was never told, and that he died in the Moundsville Penitentiary. So it was euphemistically referred to in my family as when Father had his troubles, blah, 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 you know. But they never said what Father's troubles were, other than the fact that he'd lost his money in the Depression. So when I found out that Father had a few more troubles than that, I wrote this book. And I fictionalized it because two reasons. One was because it made it a whole lot easier to write about people who were my flesh and blood when I was thinking of them as someone else. And because I didn't want to get sued for stories that I didn't know to be absolutely true. So it's written in two time frames. So it's the girl's pursuit of this story, and it's the grandfather's story of how he got into the difficulties that he got into.
And you touched on something I was going to ask you about that historical fiction genre, which is a genre that not a lot of people are familiar with, not really accustomed to reading. You know, we know nonfiction as readers, we know what fiction is, right. but historical fiction takes a little bit of both and kind of melds them together.
Right.
And when you talk about writing about family members, if you can write about the flesh and blood if there's somebody else, or you can write about, you know, areas in West Virginia, Huntington, and some of the other places that your story takes place in Father's Troubles, and that's really, I think, where the nonfiction aspect comes in. But and you kind of touched on this a moment ago, but can you talk a little bit more about the freedom that gave you to really tell the story the way you wanted to tell it, having melded in some of the fiction and blending that with the historical accounts?
I started writing it with the right names, and it was so difficult because even though I never met this man, it irritated me beyond irritation. It really angered me to think that my grandfather would do what he did to his family, and the repercussions of that over the period of time. Now, what he did wasn't all that nefarious. He kited a check, but because he was president of the bank, they called it embezzlement. And so it infuriated me that he would let himself get into a situation where his whole family just went to destitution, literally. But as soon as I gave him another name, I could create a personality and a motivation and a whole background that may or may not have been like his. But it didn't matter at that point because I wasn't so focused on trying to get the truth. And I could use his nefarious partner and do whatever I wanted to with him because I gave him a different name. And all of the characters in there, then, I could create their own personalities. And the same thing even with the girl that's, you know, ostensibly me. Her name is Maggie. I could make her as flamboyant as I wanted to, or as, you know, crazy as I wanted to, and it didn't have to be me. It could be a character. But yet, I've very carefully used Huntington and the time frame, and I even I spent many, many weeks in the West Virginia archives when I discovered that the records for the bank that he ran were there. And so I took the letters that corroborated the story, and some of them are in the book. They're, again, fictionalized as to the names of the people and the names of the bank, but the words in those letters are accurately what transpired. And only a very few of them did I actually make up, and they were the ones, the personal letters between Lawrence, the protagonist, and Anna, his wife. So I really think it had, and I used specific dates too for when things happened. So it has an air of authenticity about it, but it's clearly a fiction.
And as we mentioned a moment ago, Father's Troubles named as a finalist for the prestigious Forward Magazine 2003 Book of the Year Award in historical fiction. And that leads us to your second book, Amo Amas Amat, and I apologize for getting that mixed up a minute ago. An unconventional love story. Talk to us a little bit about the impetus for that story, where that came from, and then we'll talk more
Okay.
about it.
Well, when I lived in Georgia, my very best friend, Allison, that I spoke about, is a lesbian. She was a lesbian. She's deceased now. And she and her partner were my best friends. And many of the people that I knew there were gay or lesbian. And I realized that in West Virginia, that probably wouldn't have been the case. And that there was still such an undercurrent. Now, it's changed even since I published the book a couple of years ago. But there was such an undercurrent of misunderstanding about how people could be friends with and accept a lesbian relationship or a gay relationship that I decided to write a book about it. When I moved back here, somebody made a crack that annoyed me about that. And that sort of set the wheels in motion. You know, just one of those offhanded remarks that people make about gay people. So that set the wheels in motion, and I decided to create a character who was horribly homophobic, and a female, and put her in a situation where she has to confront that in a variety of ways. So the story carries, Mary Kate is her name, and she lives in Asheville, North Carolina. And she's always looked for Prince Charming, thinks he's out there someplace, but she's never found him. And she's in her 30s and her biological clock's ticking, so to speak. And this is set in the 1980s, so that's before the AIDS crisis and before, you know, that was even talked about. And she meets a guy at her country club that she thinks is just wonderful. And she falls in love with him. And they marry, and only after that does she discover that he's a closeted gay man, which would not have been atypical at all, because at that time, people just didn't come out of the closet. Okay. So she's horrified by this, of course. They eventually divorce, and she moves to Atlanta. And there she develops some friendships, and only after she has developed those friendships does she discover that those people are also gay. So it's her journey through the steps of how to come to terms with that. And she comes out on the other side.
Fantastic, fantastic. Talk to us a little bit about those two books, because they're so different in subject matter. And you mentioned that Amo Amasamat sort of came through just by a little quip that someone had made that you heard about. Where do you draw inspiration for your writing? Because, you know, I find for myself as a writer, and some of our other writers that we've had here on Chapters, they say, you know, it's that thought that's in the back of my mind, or that thought that's in my deep subconscious that I just can't get rid of. It's something I hear. It's something I read about. It's something that someone has told me. It's something that, you know, I hear it once, and I'm not obsessed over it, but every now and then it just won't leave my thought, keeps coming back. Is that where a lot of your inspiration comes from? Where do you find that?
To some extent, yes, and that's particularly true with the Amo Amasamat, which, by the way, is Latin for I love, you love, he, she, or it loves. And I use that because homosexuality, you know, goes back to forever, you know. So, yes, it does, in a sense. I think almost every author will tell you, if they're honest, that they write from themselves. Either it's an occurrence, or it's something like that, a quip that somebody makes, or as Amy Tan says, she writes to discover herself. Pat Conroy says he writes to get rid of his demons. So there's all of that, and I think, again, they may not ever say it, but I think in everybody's novel, everybody's book, there's a part of themselves. And there surely is in this, you know, and certainly in Father's Troubles. And I think that's true for most writers. And so it's either something that's been nagging at you for a long time, or it's something like that that's a part of your life that made a difference, meant something important to you that you feel like you need to share.
And I know that you have, outside of Amo Amasamat and Father's Troubles, you have a couple of really exciting projects that we want to talk about upcoming. One's a little more short-term project that's upcoming, and one's a farther along project that's upcoming.
Right.
So we'll start with the short-term one first.
Okay.
Tell us what you've been working on, what you have coming out in the future for our viewers, then we'll talk about your longer-term project.
Right. Well, the next book that'll come out will be in the spring, and it is a nonfiction. But in a sense, it's creative nonfiction to some degree as well. And again, this was born out of my life, in a sense. Back in the 70s, early 70s, I ran a craft cooperative here in Huntington for 15 years, till mid-80s. And it was called Appalachian Craftsman, and many people in Huntington still have products that they bought from us. They lasted forever. It was a patchwork and quilting co-op of about 250 women all over Cowawayne, Mason, Lincoln, and Upshur counties. And during that time, I spent almost every summer, I did spend every summer, at least a week of it, at the Mountain State Art and Craft Fair. And while I was there, I would meet all of these other artisans. You know, the place was 160 artisans maybe. But a lot of them didn't have a West Virginia twang. You know, they clearly had a Long Island accent or a Boston accent or something, and I kept thinking, where did these people come from? I don't get it, you know. But it didn't really matter to us because we were all there with a common problem, you know, to sell our goods. And only again when Allison said to me, where did these people come from, did I decide to try and do something to figure that out. And so I decided to go back and interview all these people that I'd known and then find others that I didn't know. I got a grant from the West Virginia Humanities Commission and set about for 2 years doing interviews. I interviewed something like 45 or 50 people all over West Virginia who are artists and musicians who came here in the 60s and 70s during the Back to the Land movement, you know, after the Vietnam War or during the Vietnam War, who thought they needed to go someplace where if the world blew up and went to hell in a handbasket, they'd be safe. And they wanted to live rurally and go back to the land and homestead and do it from scratch. And they came to West Virginia in droves, lots and lots of them. And the ones who succeeded figured out pretty early on that living like that was more difficult than they thought it would be. And they usually learned or brought with them a craft that they could make money on, pin money. So that when, you know, the ideal was that you were self-sufficient, that you did it all on your own land. Well, that doesn't always work. You still have to have, you know, propane for the generator and gas for the tractor and, you know, so you got to have money for some things. And they sold their products to do that. And the bottom line is that they became so successful that they were the very beginning artisans for Tamarack. And I'm telling their stories. And the reason I wanted to do that was because, first of all, that I knew so many of them, but secondly, most books about West Virginia artists have to do with people like Kathy Mattea. No disrespect to her, but that she was born here, but she didn't become successful in West Virginia. Mm-hmm. And there are no stories written to date until this one comes out in the spring about the people who came here and were successful here. And so I wanted to tell their stories. So, and the other people who did that were musicians, and they were the Putnam County Pickers to begin with, mm-hmm. and then they became the basis for Mountain Stage Band. And those, to me, are the two best, the best advertisements West Virginia's got.
Absolutely.
And so I wanted to celebrate that.
And that's coming out in the spring of 2014,
yes.
and the title of that book is?
Cash Crop.
Cash Crop, okay. And then in our final moments here, let's talk about your longer-term project, which is something that a lot of people are going to identify with. And this is a book that you've been working on in conjunction with West Virginia University Press, a biography of Ken Heckler's life. And,
that's right.
And let me start let me play devil's advocate for
Okay.
for just a moment about Ken Heckler and say this, that West Virginia, when you talk about its history, has had some famous and some very infamous politicians. We've had Arch Moore, we've had Jay Rockefeller, we've had the Mansions, we've had A. James and Joe now, who's currently a senator in West Virginia. So why Ken Heckler? Why him? Why should someone who wants to learn about West Virginia or about an interesting West Virginian? Why Ken Heckler? What's so what's so special about Ken Heckler?
Well, Ken Heckler is identified with West Virginia because I think primarily he's identified with West Virginia because of his work on the Black Lung Bill. He is the senator, the congressman who was able to push through the first piece of legislation that compensated miners for black lung and allowed them to be tested before they died to prove that they had it. And miners all over West Virginia probably still recognize who he is because of that. Mm-hmm. But he had so many other careers, Eliot, before that, that it's just, he's a remarkable man. He covers the last 100 years of the country's history. Mm-hmm. He was, first of all, he was a professor at Marshall, at Princeton, at Columbia. He was a war historian in the Second World War and documented almost every major battle in the Second World War in the European theater, including the battle at Remagen, where they blew up the bridge. He wrote a book about that, which was turned into a movie, which was extremely well received, and I think it sold something like 650,000 copies. I could aspire to that. He then went to work for President Truman. He was one of Truman's right-hand men, advisors, so forth. He speech wrote for him, speech wrote for Stevenson and Kefauver. He then came to West Virginia, and that's when he began to teach at Marshall, and had only been here a year when he ran for Congress and defeated an incumbent with a long history in Huntington and served for 18 years in Congress. He resigned to go on and do some other things, and then he became Secretary of State here for another 16 years, you know. And then after that, he became an environmental activist and has been extremely vocal about the issue of mountaintop removal. So he's just, you know, he encompasses so much, and I could write one book about each one of those segments.
Sure.
And never finish practically.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
I know we have a timetable set up for cash crop, which is
Right.
Spring of 2014. But I can only imagine someone who's done so much and, like, as you said, has lived the last 100 years. And I'm a fan of Ken Heckler. I think everything that he's done, my goodness,
Yeah.
what a great contribution, you know, to West Virginia as a state, but also to our nation. But I can only imagine what that's like, trying to wrap your arms around the information over 100 years, and I know that's kind of sort of where you are right now with that project, working on the research.
I'm doing interviews with him. He's still alive and well and sharp as a tack. So I spend as much time as I can talking to him and interviewing him and asking him questions and getting his feelings and his thoughts about stuff. And that's not to say that there's not a lot of documentation, because at Marshall University in the archives, there are 700 boxes of his papers. And I haven't even touched that. So in order to wrap my arms around it, literally, I have a big, long hallway that's part of my office. And it now has a big stretch of butcher paper on it. And it starts clear over here at 1914 when he was born and goes all the way down the hall to 2013, where he will be 99 in September. So I'm trying to, you know, put it in perspective as to what else was going on in the world when he was doing certain things, trying to, you know, highlight the Kennedy assassination. Where was he then? What was he doing? when the Twin Towers fell. I mean, all of these different things that we recognize as historical markers in our country, and then where was Ken and what was his role or what was his part in any of that. He was on the very first Space and Technology Committee and was responsible for convincing Congress to give him enough money to do the shot to the moon. He's just, you name something, and he's had a part in it.
Fantastic. I know that's going to be a great book, and we look forward to getting updates on that. We certainly will have you back on when you get closer to having that book released, because I think that's going to be a fascinating a piece of writing and a fascinating collection of history about an extraordinary West Virginian. So Carter, let me ask you as we finish up in our final few moments here, if anyone's interested in corresponding with you, getting copies of Amo Amasamat or Father's Troubles or the upcoming cash crop, how can they get a hold of you?
Well, I have a website also. It's carterseaton.com, and you can order both books there. They're also electronically available. They're ebooks, and you can get those from Amazon. And the hardback copies are in several bookstores around Huntington. But you can just contact me there at carterseaton.com. There's an email address. It's carter@carterseaton.com.
All right, fantastic. Carter Seaton, thank you so much for coming on. We appreciate it, and we wish you good luck, not only with Cash Crop, but with the biography on Ken Heckler. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it.
And finally, if you have a question, comment, or story suggestion about this chapter's program, any chapter's program you've seen previously, or any other program that you've watched here on Armstrong Cable, we would like to hear from you. You can send us an email at lp4@zoominternet.net. That is the letter L, the letter P, number 4, at zoominternet.net. We certainly do take the time to read your questions and your comments and your suggestions about the programming that you see here on Armstrong Cable, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Chapters, and we appreciate you joining us this time, and we invite you to come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community. I'm Eliot Parker. Thanks for joining us.